we get started? Okay, so welcome again, everybody, to our second course meeting for the Introduction to Birdwatching seminar. Again, my name is Chris, and with us again tonight, as we were last week, are Dana and Hisao and John and Marissa. Tonight, what we're going to do is go into the field. And so what our focus tonight is going to be our tips and other information that will help you with the identification of birds, trying to figure out why they are where they are, so that when you go out into the field, you have a much more enjoyable experience rather than a very frustrating one, which I know when I was starting, because I didn't have this class, I was a quite frustrated beginning birder. I just want to, before we get started, mention that last week's meeting is posted on our website, dcaudubonsociety.org. So if you had to duck out early last week, or if you didn't join us last week, you can go and watch last week's meeting. And the same will be true of this week. We will be posting this week's meeting on our website also. And Marissa had just posted a reminder a minute ago that we are recording, so please note that. The other thing I just want to mention is we are having another webinar tomorrow evening at the same time at 7 p.m. on bird-friendly plants and gardening. So if you are interested in maybe attracting birds to your yard, or are thinking maybe a little bit long-term about some landscaping or other type of work you might be doing at your house or your apartment and want to think about what might be best for birds, we're going to have a whole discussion and presentation on that tomorrow night. So please, if you are interested, come back and join us then. Also, as with last week, we're going to have a chat room running throughout the class. So if you do have questions or just observations or thoughts, please feel free to use the chat room, and we'll be responding hopefully in real time. And then, as also with last week, we'll have some time at the end for a more open-ended discussion if you'd rather leave your question until then. Okay, so I'm going to turn things over to Marissa, who is going to get us started tonight.
Thanks, Chris. One more note before we get started too. I just added a link to the chat to our feedback form. It's really early for you to give feedback now, but in case you have to step away early, you have the link. We would really like to know how this webinar worked for you. If you have suggestions, we really want to be able to incorporate them in the future. This is our first time running through this course as a webinar instead of an in-person class, and we would love to know how we can make it better. So thanks. All right, we're getting started on part 2. Last week we covered how to use binoculars, which field guides and apps are available to help you get started birding. How do you choose where you're going to go out looking? And now we're talking about everything you need to know while you're actually birding. And a lot of that, especially for those of us who bird in groups or with another person, is describing where a bird is to someone else that you're with. And it's surprisingly not always easy and can become frustrating, even though it seems like it should be pretty straightforward. So we do have strategies for this. Some ways of doing this include the clock system, which we'll talk about next, and positioning where the bird is relative to other objects, using distinctive landmarks like trees and branches when it's safe to do so. So for instance, not now, you can stand near someone else to make sure you're kind of in the same line of sight. You're actually looking at the same, kind of from the same vantage point. And if you're not seeing a bird that someone else is seeing, don't be afraid to move around. If we go to the next slide, we'll talk a little bit more about the clock system. The way this works, this is a common strategy people use. It usually works when there's a big object that you can look at that's vaguely round, like a tree. You imagine the surface of a clock imposed on the object, and then use the hours to describe where the bird is. So if we go to the next slide, we'll see a clock superimposed on this tree here. And say, if you say a bird is at 12 o'clock, you'd be looking right up at the top of the tree. If it's at 9, it's on the left side, about midway through, 6 at the bottom. And you can also use position from the edge of the branch or the trunk or other layers to help people find the bird or find the bird that someone else is trying to describe. One other note here is, and we're doing this not because there's like rules that you have to use the clock system when you're talking about birds, but say you're a beginning bird watcher and you end up on a DC Audubon field trip. This is the kind of thing that people might use. They might say, hey, we've got a cardinal and it's at 2 o'clock in this tree. And so we want to make sure that people are aware that this is some terminology that people use. If you're fortunate enough to be birding on a boat, the clock system is still used, but it's kind of horizontally in space. So a bird on the water off the bow of the boat, front of the boat, would be at 12 o'clock. A bird off the stern would be 6 o'clock. And then you know, your 3 o'clock and 9 o'clock would be your starboard and port sides. So next up, we're going to run through an example. If I were to say to you that there's a bird at 10 o'clock in this tree, where would you look? That's a few feet from the edge of the crown of the tree. I know it's hard for you to actually answer this in person. We'd have you actually point, but just take a moment, think where you think it to be, and then next slide, please. So that's approximately where this not at all to scale cardinal would be in this tree here using the clock system. All right, so next we can move on to a few other examples and ways of doing this. Again, I'm going to be running through some examples. Again, this is like, it's kind of, hopefully it's fun. I know it's not necessarily that hard, but it is a surprisingly large part of birding. So say we see a bird, it's on the water, it's under the bridge, and it's between the first and second pillars relative to the sort of near shore here of the river. If we take a moment to think about it, and then we can go to the next slide. To reveal the not at all to scale Canada goose in the water there. Hopefully that description worked. Again, if you have questions, please chime in the chat. And we've got few other examples of these. We're going to run through and do some practice. Next slide, please. We can go to the next slide now. All right, thanks. So I'm going to describe it. We're going to play the game. It's a little bit of a one-sided game since I know you don't have audio, but just bear with me. All right, I see a bird, and if you look on the horizon line, you can see there's the tallest tree that has no branches. So not the thick one, but the thinnest one that's the tallest is kind of sticking up from a light green tree. If you look down on the railing below that tree, we'll see a bird. And next slide to reveal where the bird is. All right, there's the belted kingfisher. This is the female. Again, I'm just placing some birds on some slides here. All right, next one, got another challenge. This is a complicated one inspired by a real birding observation event. This is Freedom Plaza, downtown DC. So here we're looking at the building on the right that has a red brick roof. And midway along, there's like some columns and pillars pointing back toward the clock tower, but kind of midway along where there's those like a railing just below, we have a bird. Moment to think where it is. We'll go to the next slide. All right, it's a peregrine falcon, again, inspired by true sightings here in DC. And finally, third challenge. Here's a forested scene. It could be really complicated, but we can use landmarks and existing trees to do this. You could try to do this one with the clock system, but I think I'm just gonna do it with landmarks. You look at the thickest tree that we can see, it's got a broken off branch that's pointing off to the left. It's almost like that branch is pointing at the bird, and it's in the thin trees over to the left next to that broken off branch on the big tree. And next slide. It's a tufted titmouse. So hopefully those worked. If those things weren't working for you, let us know what your questions were. Of course, that's just my example. And again, we do this, it's kind of silly, but it's very important to know. We can go to the next slide. Hand things over to Dana.
Okay, so the next thing we're going to talk about is basic taxonomy. So this is kind of where we get into the science and the questions of how many different types of birds are there, how are they organized. So taxonomy is the science of defining and naming groups of biological organisms on the basis of shared characteristics. And it all goes back to the 1700s, this guy, Linnaeus, who asked these really, at the time, hard to answer questions. And they're still hard to answer now because, you know, are there species that we haven't discovered on Earth? Yes. Are there species that we think are one species that might be more than one? Yes. So this is where it gets a little bit tricky, and I hope that we don't get too into the weeds. But back in the 1700s, a lot of different people contributed to this list of plants and animals. They were able to put together a list of over 7,000 species of plants and over 4,000 species of animals. And Linnaeus had this idea of organizing all of the plants and animals based off of their appearances and similarities, so grouping them. Next slide. So modern taxonomy is really informed by phylogenetics. And what's that? That's information about the evolutionary history of organisms, so how things are related. For example, humans, we share a common ancestor with chimps, so that's our closest relative. We share 99% of our DNA. Back in the day, we didn't know about genomes. We didn't have all the information that we have now. And so people organized animals and plants and other life based off of their traits. And some traits are informative of if you have a shared evolutionary past and others aren't. For example, wings, birds, bats, dragonflies, other things all have wings and fly, but it's not because these organisms are closely related. They're all animals, but it's because this type of adaptation occurred many times in nature. So true taxonomy and classification seeks to distinguish these inherited traits from those that don't really show the evolutionary relationship. And so when we think about birds are animals. There are these science words that you may have learned in grade school, like kingdom Animalia, as opposed to, you know, the kingdom of plants or other kingdoms of life, so the highest level of classification. Birds have backbones. They're in phylum Chordata. That's everything with a backbone, as opposed to our invertebrates that are also animals. And they're in the class Aves. And so this is where we start really looking at the traits that birds have, which are feathers, they're winged, they're bipedal, they're warm-blooded, they're egg-laying vertebrates, as opposed to our other vertebrates, mammals, fish, reptiles, amphibians. So those are other classes. All right, next slide. All right, so what do we have here? On the right, we kind of have the hierarchy. So all of taxonomy is about these hierarchies. And you can see that birds are a large class of organisms. When we start getting down into breaking these birds into smaller groups, we can think about orders. There are 23 different orders of birds. And this can be groups like owls, perching birds, parrots are just some examples that I chose because these are more simple groups. Some groups have, at the order level, have lots of different types of birds in them. And there are some groups that people use when they're birding that aren't related to these phylogenies or evolutionary histories or this classification. So this is where this topic gets a little bit confusing to people. And I can tell you, I'm a scientist. I know about some groups more than others. Scientists argue with each other, and this will change. I noticed myself as I was putting together old bird list into the eBird that some species, their names had changed and some groups had changed. So people are always revising this based off of new information. When we get down to the family level, this is where it's really relevant to bird watching. If you have purchased a field guide or if you have a few, we noticed that most field guides, except the one that Marissa pointed out that was organized by color, tend to be organized with this taxonomy in mind. So based off of science and the proper classification of organisms. Next slide. So just to give you an overview, when you look at your bird field guide, you're going to see these different orders. And almost all of them, they start with this order that has ducks, geese, and swans, and they go to the perching birds. There's 2 columns of information, so it's kind of like chronological. And so these are some groups that you should be aware of. And as you start learning about birds, it will help you understand, like if you see a small songbird, look in the back of your book. And so these are just things that, you know, are good to know about so that you can start understanding how to identify birds and where to look and how to get more information. And all the birds, or all the types of birds from these orders that are in bold on this slide are actually birds that are seen in DC. So you can see that we have a large representation. Next slide. Okay, so to just review, we think about the tree of life. This is a common concept in biology and evolution. You know, the trunk is really showing us that all life is related. We can think about the large branches as the orders, some of the smaller branches as the families, and when you're talking about a species, you're really talking about the leaves. So we see a lot of times that this is a really good way of communicating those relationships and to group the relationships so that the branches that are closer are more closely related. And it gives you an idea of how many different species there really are. In North America, over 1,000 birds that you can see. In DC, there's been over 300 birds seen. Thinking about this from a global perspective, there are about 10,000 species in the world. And in areas that are hotspots like Colombia in South America, there's almost 2,000 different birds that you can see there. All right, next slide. So even though we just talked about this taxonomy and grouping things and how the field guides are organized, and there's many different layers of these hierarchies to put all the different animals and plants and other types of life into their proper category, there are some generic terms that people use when they're talking about birds. So a really good one to know is waterfowl. So this is really your geese, your ducks, both diving and dabbling ducks, which are 2 different types, and swans. These birds have similar characteristics, webbed feet, athletic flyers, broad bills. They're mostly aquatic. And are they a taxonomic group? Yes, they have the same family. Next slide. All right, other birds to know. Raptors. So what is a raptor, or bird of prey? These include hawks, falcons, vultures, owls. They have similar characteristics. They hunt live prey, with some exceptions, are scavengers. They have sharp, powerful, curved beaks, strong feet with talons. That's a good way of telling if it's a raptor or not. They're usually larger bodied and they have keen eyesight, although we see some owls that are the size of robins. So there's always a couple exceptions, but people often talk about raptors, so it's a good group to know. And is it a taxonomic group? No. So these are in different parts of your field guide. Some of them will group them into, for example, diurnal raptors and put all those different birds that are hunting during the day in one section, sometimes, and then put the owls in a different section. But this is a good generic term to be aware of. Next slide. Okay, another good group to know is our songbirds, the passerines, or perching birds. And it's important to recognize that this is about 60% of all species globally. They have these similar shared characteristics. They have 3 toes that face forward and 1 that faces backwards. They have legs that have extra strength for perching. And their chicks require a lot of parental care. So they're things that you may see in DC, robin nest, cardinal nest, things like that that are common in more urbanized areas. When the eggs hatch, there are babies that have few feathers, and the parents must take care of them until they're 12 to 16 days old and they can fledge. So is this a taxonomic group? Yes. And the thing to point out is there's dozens of families and thousands of species in this group globally. All right, next slide. Another fun group to know is the Corvids, or family Corvidae. So these are our crows, jays, magpies, ravens. Is it a taxonomic group? Yes. They're medium to large, intelligent, gregarious birds. They often have a harsh voice. They have a powerful all-purpose bill. We see a lot of these species in DC, and a lot of people, for whatever reason, know what corvids are. The family is a popular name, so you may hear that. And these are in that greater order passerines, or perching birds, or songbirds, you often hear them called. Next slide. Another good group to know are sparrows. These are kind of streaky seed-eating birds. They have conical bills. They have distinct head patterns. To me, they're very difficult to tell apart, some of them. A lot of the males and females have slightly different plumages. I think that the key point to point out, if you go next slide, one of our most common sparrows is the house sparrow, but this is not one of our New World sparrows. So all of these sparrows, the song sparrow, the towhee, the chipping sparrow, the Savannah sparrow, they're all in the same family, so they're all closely related. But the house sparrow that we have in DC, and this is the male in this tiny picture, they actually are from the Old World, and so they were brought over here, and they're not closely related. So even though they're called sparrows, it's something to think about. There are things between the Old World and the New World that are called sparrow or warbler that are not closely related. Next slide. One more. Okay, and warblers, another good group to know. They have a lot of similar characteristics. Most of them are arboreal, but not all of them. They're migratory, so these are birds that fly every year to wintering grounds in southern, in parts of Mexico and Central America and South America. They're known for warbling and complicated songs. Males are often very colorful, so these are some of our striking, brightly colored yellow, blue, orange birds. They have tiny, thin, pointed bills. A lot of them gleam insects, and they're extremely active, so they're hopping around quite a bit. So these are passerines that are in just one of the many families. It's in that passerine order. Is it a taxonomic group? Yes. Previously, there were some other species that weren't actually as closely related that were put in this group. And so if you look at older field guides, you may see things like the chat put in the warbler group, which has now been removed. A lot of phylogenetic research, so research into the relationships and how closely related these birds are to each other has gone on in the last 10 years. And so we've actually seen some of the genuses change. And so also if you look at older field guides, you may see some new names, but often the common name is the same. So I think that's the last slide. Hassao, will you make sure? Oh, nope. So we have a review. So I know that's a lot of information. This is one of the concepts that I think is really confusing. It takes a long time to learn, so you just have to kind of chip away at it. But ultimately, it helps you utilize your resources better and helps you communicate with other birders if you know what type of bird they're looking for and some of the behaviors and types of habitat where you might find these types of birds. But just to review, there are many bird orders in North America. Waterfowl, it's an order. There's a family with a few main types of birds. These are ducks, geese, swans. Raptors, it's a big group with 3 orders that are not all closely related, shown here. So these are our birds with talons, our predators. And the perching birds, songbirds order, where there's 60% of the birds on the planet are this type of bird, so it's the most diverse. And we talked a little bit about the corvids, the sparrows, and warblers. All right, thanks. I think I'm turning it back over to Marissa.
Thanks, So next we're going to talk about, we're going to, in the rest of the presentation, run through the four keys to bird identification. And we've also added a fifth one, which is vocalizations, which we'll talk about at the end. We are adapting this from Cornell Lab of Ornithology. They have a lot of fantastic resources out there, so we definitely recommend checking that out as well. Next slide, please. We're going to start off with learning the parts of the bird, and a lot like taxonomy. I mean, certainly this gets very scientific. There are a lot of terms you can learn, but we're going to focus in this class on the common terms that come up when you're a new birder and you're hearing people talk about things and using terms that that come up. There's the bird pictured here on the slide on the left side has a range of terms, including somewhat less technical terms. So all the feather groups on a bird are named. And this illustration here does a nice job of covering the common terms you might hear. For instance, the top of the head is a crown. The back of the head, it's the bird's neck is often called its nape, which is a good thing to be aware of. The back of the bird is called its back, or sometimes its mantle. The rump is a common, is a term we use like right above the tail where you would expect it. But a lot of times coloration on birds affects specific feather groups. And so there's like a yellow rumped warbler, and this has in fact this yellow rump. So these terms can be helpful to use. There are upper tail coverts. Coverts is just a term that means body covering feathers, as opposed to the stiffer and longer tail feathers and wing feathers. So coverts will come up a lot. There's of course the tail. Sometimes you'll hear it called retrices as the name of these actual feathers, especially when talking about woodpeckers and things. But for the most part, tail will get the job done. Then there's the undertail coverts, of course. A lot of these other ones are self-explanatory. Bird leg. Interesting note here, they point out the bird's thigh. A lot of people are like, isn't that the bird's knee? But actually no, so birds are kind of standing on their toes. And the portion of their leg that leads up to where the feathers begin is kind of leading up to the bird's heel. And then it continues up from there. So I think the other features we'll point out is people often talk about the breast of a bird, which is, the front part, the chest area, and it's a common area where you see distinguishing features like spots, streaks, colors, light, dark. So it's a common one that shows up there. Sparrows in particular. So we have in the middle of the slide, we've got the head of sparrow. And here you can see again how we have names for these parts, and coloration often affects these specific feather groups. So it's important to pay attention to the upper and lower beaks. Also, sometimes heard mandibles. That's the other term for like the portions of a bird's jaw. The lore is the space between the eye and the beak. A lot of birds have interestingly colored throats or throat patches. They'll have whiskers or mustaches. An eye line, which is this line running kind of through the eye, but extending past to the back of the head. There's an eyebrow stripe, a crown stripe, and stripes on its head. So again, these are things like once you start looking closely, you see a lot of these features here. And finally, we've got a picture of a gull in flight to show a wing extended. Some of the major terms to know here are primaries. This is referring to the primary flight feathers. These are the ones out at the end, the farthest reach, just the longest flight feathers. And then the secondaries are the ones also on the trailing edge of the wing that extend back to the bird's bodies. Again, you can see terms like coverts showing up here for the wing coverings. And fun fact, the alula is this kind of feather group that sticks out. It's kind of like the bird's thumb, and it can help with aerodynamics as they're flying, kind of helps. I don't actually know exactly what it does, but I think it helps with aerodynamics there. And again, here on the skull, the back of the bird is called the mantle, as I pointed out. Scapulars cover shoulder parts, and then again, we have these body covering feathers called coverts in various groups. And if you'll hit one next slide, we also want to point out a lot of birds like cardinals and titmice, I think titmice, have a crest. And so that's a common term to know when you're bird watching. Right, next slide. Coloration and parts of a bird often go hand in hand. Again, because these colors and patterns tend to affect specific feather groups, how the feathers grow, and they can be really useful tools for giving you the terminology to describe a bird that you see, to remember the features that you see. If you don't have the vocabulary for something, sometimes it can be tricky to keep straight what you're seeing. And another note we wanted to point out here is that coloration varies between individuals within a species. For instance, we've got up at the top, the yellowbirds are a male and female American goldfinch. The male has this really striking black cap in breeding season in particular, whereas the female doesn't have that so much. You can see they have black and white on their feathers, but actually these are sort of the greater and median feathers have the coverts have what we call wing bars showing up there. And you can see a lot of the body covering on the back and the nape. And part of the crown is yellow, the breast is yellow, but the wing feathers are black and white, and so is the tail. Coloration also varies as individuals mature. So here we have two bald eagles. The one on the left is an adult bald eagle with a characteristic white head and white tail, but they take about 4 years to mature. And as they're growing up, the juveniles are mottled brown. So you might see birds looking like this that are lacking that, but really obvious white head and crown. They're still bald eagles. And then at the bottom, we have the example of the scarlet tanager, which is a bird that's around now in spring migration. You can see the female, the male, and the non-breeding male all have different plumages. And next slide. Now we're going to run through a bit of an activity here where as sort of interactive as we can be on this webinar. We're putting up a bird here, and I'd like you to call out the parts of the birds that you see in the chat. So if you saw this bird and got a quick glimpse of it, what would be some of the features that you would notice about it? Oh, and I'm also seeing, I'll give you this a moment to put in some comments on this bird here. What do you notice? What's the shape of its beak? What's the shape of its tail? What are its patterns? What colors do you see? In the meantime, we have a question about what's the difference between a breeding and non-breeding male. Some of this breeding is seasonal. So in the spring and summer when birds are mating, they might have their breeding plumage when the males look very sharp and colorful. And then in the winter and fall, they'll molt their feathers and have less colorful plumage. And another time is it might take the birds months to years to mature. And so when younger males are not quite ready to mate, they have a different plumage than when they're fully mature and in their breeding plumage. All right, so a lot of the, when the wings are, I also see when the wings are down and folded, how do you tell the primaries from the secondaries? Great, I'll talk about that when we look at this bird, and I think we'll have a couple other examples in some of these, we have a couple of these coloration activities. But looking through the chats, I can see that people have added that this bird has an eyebrow, a white eyebrow, that's absolutely right. A white throat, yep, barred wings. This color on the breast is often called buff or buffy, so that's one to point out because I really only hear that in the birding context. Like I'm not like, oh, look at this buffy coat that someone is wearing, but we talk about it on birds a lot apparently. We've got a downwards curved bill. That's absolutely right. Yes, barred wings. That's another term that shows up is when we have these speckles or lines that are striped. And let's see, an off-white or buff belly. That's absolutely right. What else do we have here? One thing I'll point out, this is just a fun feature to pay attention to. If we go to the next slide, we'll see the name of this bird. It's a Carolina wren. And if you look just under its tail, the undertail coverts have these black and white bars on them. So it's a different type of barring than you see on the top of the tail and the wings. So we had a question about telling the primaries from the secondaries when the wings are folded. I wish I could use my mouse, but he thought maybe you can help me out. When the wings are folded, basically these ones, I'm not an expert at this, but I'm pretty sure the ones that are folded down here would be the primaries. And then as you sort of move to the upper part of, so those where his dows now are the greater and median coverts, the smaller and larger feathers that have little white dots on them. And then if you move toward the back of the bird, but still on the wings, those would be the folded up secondaries. And then toward the very end of that stack of flight feathers would be the tertials. Well, I think we'll have some other examples where we can look at that too. And again, like this is not necessary for birding 101, but it's fun. You can see these parts of feather groups are useful for flight, and they do often have different colorations associated with them. And we had a question about the eye stripe. I think a lot of plumage is like, there could be many like reasons why, and we might not always know all of them. I'm not sure of an exact, like, for instance, is it important for sexual selection? Do mates prefer it? I'm not sure about that. I'm not sure if it helps them be more striking to one another. I'm not sure about that, but if other people know or have ideas, I'd be interested to hear them. And in the meantime, we will grow, we will go to the next example. Okay. Same process as last time. In the chat, please share your observations of what features you see on this bird. If you were explaining it to someone and you wanted them to help ID it or show them what you saw. Yeah, we have got a white striped crown. That's right. So we've got black and white on the head of the bird. An eyebrow stripe with yellow lores, yes. So we do have yellow showing up there. It has a long tail, right? While we're waiting, if we wanted to see the bird, you can see the primaries and secondaries and tertials, the median coverts and the greater coverts on this bird. We don't have to go through all of it, but like the bottom, like if you're looking at the tips of the wings, that first stack of feathers would be the primaries. The kind of horizontally stacked feathers would be the secondaries, and then those three dark brown ones that you see are the tertials. It does have a slight fork or notch. I just saw that show up in the chat, a slight fork or notch in the tail. It's a good feature to pay attention to. On the white-crowned sparrow, I don't remember if that's a diagnostic feature or if it's like how this bird is holding its tail, but many birds do have like a very distinctive notch, like finches, goldfinches have that. Sparrows or swallows can have that too, deeply forked tails. White, oh, sorry?
I was gonna say, it also depends on the molt of the bird because as the tail gets older, it wears out. And so sometimes depending on how that aging of the feathers go, it can make the fork look more distinct. It's pretty subtle here though.
Yeah, thanks. That's a great point. And then we had a question in the chat, the white-tipped feathers. Not quite sure what those feathers are called. So those would be the greater coverts and the median coverts on the wings. At least I'm assuming that's what we're looking at. And then sometimes we'll hear people talk about, I don't know if people say that this bird has these, but sometimes those can be really pronounced and it results in what we call wing bars. So if someone's talking about that, it's these like tips on these covert feathers here would create wing bars. And then of course, another one to call out is of course, this bird has a white throat. And if we go to the next slide, it is a white-throated sparrow, which they're around through the fall, winter, and part of spring in DC. And then they'll be not around in the summer. And then I think that's about it. Thanks, everyone. All right, finally, I actually think we have one more after this. Got another very different shaped bird here. What do you notice? Yellow legs and feet, absolutely. You can see here how, oh yeah, sorry, we've got white with black tipped wings. Yeah, the bird is white overall, the under of the tail, the breast, the head. The underside of the wings is mostly white, but we've got these black tips on the primaries with white notches at the very ends of the flight feathers. And yeah, the tail is fanned out. This is one where it's, yeah, it's important to note the color of the bill. This bill is mostly yellow. And I think if we can go to the next slide, we'll see reveal the name of the bird. Oh, it's got a curved bill. Yeah, part of that is the angle here. And one thing I'll point out that doesn't show up really well in this picture, we go to the next, oh, he still had to step away. But this bird is a ring-billed gull, which is a common bill in DC. And if you, the picture doesn't show it very well, but if you look, there is also a black kind of notch or black ring around the end of this bill, this gull's bill. Again, ring-billed gull. And its bill is curved, but it's sort of like got this classic fish eating type of bill where it's primarily straight and then it dips down at the end. All right, and next one, final exercise, I believe. And we can go to the next slide to move on to the next. All right, another very differently shaped bird. What do you notice? Got black and white crown stripes. That's absolutely right. Got big stripes. We've got sort of a white mustache or black mustache. I don't remember exactly which one goes where. We've got a stripy head. Got spots on the wings. That's right, on the flight feathers. A white belly, no red cap. So someone's noticing this is can be useful for telling the male versus female in this species. It's got a white eye ring. Yeah, so it's got a partial eye ring, I would say. Sometimes birds have eye rings that go all the way around. And this one, it looks like we've got sort of a partial white around the eye. But yeah, that's a great observation. White primary coverts. I'm not sure, let me see. I would think that the primary coverts would be in the black, and the white I'm seeing is the back of the bird, so like the back coverts of the bird, but that's a good one. This is where I'm not totally sure. Oh yeah, so yeah, it's, and then I see there's notes on the tail feathers that it does have a notched tail. It is sort of forked like that. Another thing about this tail is, bird has a very stiff tail. We've got some white outer tail feathers and black inner tail feathers. And then of course there are some black spots on the outside. What else? All right, it's got a black beak. Great. All right, so we can go to the next slide and we'll reveal the name of this bird. This is a downy woodpecker. And as someone was pointing out in the chat, this is a female. The males have red on their head. This one's lacking that. And some of these characteristics can be helpful. It's, you know, we would know the size of the bill to help to distinguish this from a hairy woodpecker, but also having these spots on the outer tail feathers here can be very helpful. All right, thanks everyone for contributing in the chat to help make that a little more interactive. We can go to the next slide. Oh, I forgot one. I'm sorry. We'll go quickly. Included this one mostly because I really want to talk about undertail coverts again, apparently. If you can share some observations you have in the chat, we'll talk about this bird. We also put this one in here because a lot of times it's easy to look at a bird like this and say it's all gray. And then you might see it from a different angle and realize that there's a lot more to it. It's got a black crown, absolutely. So it's got this cap that's black, dark eye. Oh, we've got people noticing the shape of the feet. This is a passerine bird with 3 toes pointing forward and 1 toe pointing back. I believe the woodpecker we saw on the last page would be zygodactyl with 2 up and 2 down in terms of which way the toes are pointing. And we've got a gray body, gray beak, and red undertail coverts. Yeah, that's right. This is, if we go to the next slide, a gray catbird. So I believe this really is the last one. And thanks everyone for weighing in the chat and for raising all of your questions. If I missed any, we can come back to them. Otherwise, we'll move on.
Okay, hello everybody. I'll be walking you through how size, shape, flight, and behavior can all be keys to help you identify a bird you see in the field. So here we got size and shape. Size is one of the key categories that one uses to help identify a bird in the field. Without reference in the field, it can be hard to determine a bird's size. If possible, compare the bird you see with adjacent birds. Use these familiar birds here as benchmarks to estimate how big your bird is. On the left, you have a sparrow, robin, American crow, and Canada goose. These are all kind of your benchmarks, your bread boxes. Is it bigger than a bread box? Is it bigger than American crow? So it's a reference point that you can use to help you start identifying a bird. You can also use size differences in telltale parts of the bird, such as the bill, wings, and tail to help determine the relative size and ID of the bird. Note the size of these parts in relation to the overall bird. In other words, you're measuring parts of the bird against the bird itself. For example, at the bottom, you have 3 different types of raptors. In this illustration, they're all shown at the same size, but in reality, the one on the left, the falcons, they're the smallest of them all. They're about 22 inches in wingspan, all the way up to the buteos on the right, which have more like a 4-foot wingspan. So what can you determine from these silhouettes? When they're spotted way up in the sky, you're not going to be able to tell whether it's a large buteo or small falcon, but you can kind of like use the parts of the bird to help determine clues to help you ID the bird itself. Are the wings narrow compared to its length, like the merlin on the left? Also see how the length of the body is about half the wingspan here. So the length here is just about half of the wingspan here. As we move on to this exhibitor, the sharp shin hawk, note that the bird's length from head to tail is more than half of that. And the depth of the wings is a little deeper compared to the wingspan itself. Moving on to this red-tailed hawk here, we have very broad wings, but a very short body in relation to this wide wingspan here. So that's one way to measure a bird against itself. Let's take a look at how we can use size to ID these 2 types of woodpeckers. You have a downy woodpecker, as we saw on previous slides on the left, and a much larger hairy woodpecker. It's about 2 inches larger. This is probably the ideal way to distinguish between the 2 when they're side by side. You can notice the size difference right away. But what if you are seeing it out in the field on its own? One key measure is the bill length. So note on the left, you have a short bill length compared to the depth of the head. And the hairy woodpecker has a much longer beak or bill compared to the depth of its head. So here it's just about 1/3 of the length from the base of a build all the way to the back of the head. Here it's almost the same length. Identifying shape and size. When you're getting started, learn many of the common shapes. Here are some silhouettes from the iBird app that we touched upon last week. And these shapes shown here are good to kind of memorize, or just familiarize yourself with. They're loosely following the orders and families of the birds that Dana discussed earlier. Recognizing and categorizing the different shapes can start you down the path to successful ID through the different orders and groups, etc. Here's some caveats though. The shape of the bird can vary. One way is in temperature. On the left, you see this tufted titmouse, very long and sleek. In warmer weather, can fluff up to this big, cute fluff ball on the right in warmer weather as it tries to keep warm by fluffing its feathers. You can also consider the state of the bird, whether the bird is at rest or in agitation or alert. That can affect how you perceive the size and shape of the bird itself. Activity, say the bird is feeding, sleeping, or resting, that can affect the shape that you see. We've all seen, or many of us have seen, ducks on the water that have their heads tucked against their bodies. Very hard to determine the overall shape when you have a non-cooperative, quote-unquote, bird like that. Green herons, these are great birds to see around here. I've seen one recently up at Reeton Regional. It's always a treat to see them. But the state and the posture of the bird can kind of deceive you depending on what it's doing or just what posture it's in. Here we see the heron perhaps in repose, getting ready to strike at a fish in the water. Very sleek and compact, but we can see that there's a lot more going on than what's shown on the left. It has a very long neck that can be extended either when it's agitated or alert, or even if it's just looking around to get a better look like a giraffe. And its primary feature is to strike out into the water very quickly as it's fishing away and feeding away. So just in general, just be aware of the kind of exceptions. Like in any kind of IDing tool, there will be variations. For example, the variations of colors in the birds in the previous slides. Variations in size and shape can occur as well. Shape and posture. So let's take a look at shape and posture. We touched upon it a bit with the relative size of birds when you're familiarizing yourself with the different shapes. Identifying the shapes can also be helpful in distinguishing between different individuals, especially when you have a far off or imperfect view. Say you make your way down to Kenilworth Park. You're very likely to see one of these three large birds. On the left, on the bottom left, you have the turkey vulture in silhouette, an osprey, bald eagle. They're all large birds, often seen flying in the distance, but you can quickly use shape to distinguish, especially the osprey here. You'll notice the bent wings in this silhouette here. Bald eagle and turkey vulture, they have similar sizes and silhouette. The shape of the wings can appear similar. They're broad, they have the fingers on the ends, but as you look at them straight on, you'll note that vultures will tend to have more of this dihedral or V-shaped, as in vulture, and eagles, as they're soaring, will have more of a flat look as you see them straight on the horizon. Posture. So this backyard poster from Sibley is great. I love it. It's just has all the birds that you can see, or maybe you won't even see in your backyard. But once you get beyond the colors, it's a great demonstration of all the different types of postures that you can take note of as you're looking at a bird. So let's see here. You have your woodpeckers on the right in kind of an upright position. On the left here, we have some flycatchers that are perched, but in a more upright, slightly diagonal position. Titmice, chickadees, the catbird, mockingbird, they are upright. They have varying differences in their leg length, slightly more diagonal. And as you go down to, say, wrens here and the warblers, you notice that the posture is downright horizontal in many of these, many times when you see them. All the way down to the upside down pose of the breasted nuthatch here.
Mm.
Movement. Okay. Different types of movement is another great way to quickly narrow in on an ID to confirm an uncertain identification. It's also a great tool just to kind of like hone in on what you might be looking at a particular time. This time of year, we're getting up early. We're going out to see spring migrants such as warblers. What's great about the warblers is that they're typically more active than the year-round inhabitants around here. So when you're looking for warblers, look for a quick and constant movement, kind of like a chickadee that has too much coffee. It's just, it'll be flitting around quite a bit, looking for insects among the trees. Some warblers have distinct movements that are easily identifiable. The black and white warbler creeps along the tree similar to a nuthatch. So that is quite easy to identify just by its movements along the tree. Here we have an American redstart. It's another type of warbler. The movements are very quick, as you see, but also what's very noticeable is it flashes its tail, hoping to flush insects as it's hunting away. But notice the video cuts are really quick because that's about as much as you're going to get in the video with this little guy. Tail wagging. So another warbler, palm warbler that has come through in the spring. It is often seen with a constantly flicking tail. Likewise, here we have a little video of a flycatcher going around. You see a little gray guy like that. And just whole body movement. The spotted sandpiper on the right. This is something I came across and far off, kind of moving the sandpiper, not sure what it is exactly. You see a little bit of brown on spots. I noticed that bobbing like that, was I sure that I had a spotted sandpiper in front of me. Flight and behavior. So another thing you can look for are differences in flying and flight patterns. Once again, this can be helpful when you're getting just a glimpse of a bird that's quickly flying by or is flying high up in the air. Note when the bird tends to soar, whether the bird tends to soar or constantly flat. For example, the red-tailed hawk in the middle here, it'll be soaring high up in the air, very little wing motion. It'll be hunting for small mammals on the ground. So just making large, repetitive circles around in the sky. Versus a crow. Typically a crow, when it's flying along, it has constant wing beats. It'll be just rowing along through the sky. Other birds, they will dip or undulate as they fly. Woodpeckers, finches are known for having some wing beats, gliding a little bit, dipping as they glide, and as they beat their wings again, they create this kind of undulating motion that's shown in this diagram here. Robins, on the lower left, we have an image of a robin. They also have this kind of intermittent flapping and gliding pattern, but they won't have the undulating motion. They will flap a little bit, glide in a straight line. So next time you're looking up at robins, take note at how their flicking wings look almost transparent in the sky, and how it's, as it glides, it's just kind of steady with a straight glide. Feeding style. So at your backyard feeder, you can notice the feeder kings, like the chickadees, woodpeckers, finches. They'll be going straight for the bird feeder. But on the left, you'll see the little white-throated sparrow will be pecking away at the ground, rarely going up to the feeder itself. So that's one example in your own backyard of how different feeding styles can be split off between different species. Flycatchers. So it's notoriously hard for me and many other bird watchers to distinguish between flycatchers, but sometimes their feeding style can provide a clue to their ID. For example, eastern wood peewees, they'll sit up on a branch, they'll see an insect, they'll sally out, catch it, and often return to the same branch or a close by branch. This illustration up in the middle shows the motions more of something like a least flycatcher, which will flit from one perch to the next and even go from tree to tree. That's something that I witnessed. Someone pointed out to me last fall, IDing the least flycatcher, just confirming his ID of a least flycatcher by seeing how it fed through the woods. Waterfowl, they all have different types of feeding styles. Here we have a northern shoveler. It's a type of dabbling duck that will often feed by having its head down in shallow waters, filtering out the food as it's going along. And see the circular motion that it has there? Often when it gets in groups, the northern shoveler, unique from other types of dabbling ducks, will perform this kind of circular motion to drum up some food. And that's something that I saw, I think last winter, not far from here, at Lake Artemisia. And lastly, flocking. So sometimes you can tell a bird by the company it keeps, or it doesn't. Flycatchers, like the one in the bottom left, when you see them locally, they're seldom seen in flocks. Many other birds tend to be loners when not migrating. For example, kingfishers, towhees, wrens, they'll often be loners. Some will be seen in smaller groups, blue jays, finches, chickadees, nuthatches, and sometimes they'll just even fly around in mixed groups. So then you have your larger groups of flocks, birds such as robins, crows, grackles, geese, starlings. They'll be often seen in larger gatherings themselves. And note that the flocking styles can differ. The most familiar example is probably the V-shaped formation of geese as they fly across the sky. Starlings, such as the one in the upper middle here, they can have large undulating murmurations that resemble schools of fish. Crows, I've seen crows returning to their nighttime roosts, flying in kind of loose but regular, steady formations. Nothing that's tight, but nothing that's just kind of random. Cedar waxwings, they've been seen quite a bit in the area recently. They have a nice tight formation as they're flying from tree to tree, seen in the bottom right image there, especially compared to a group of yellow rump warblers that might be more random and just chaotic in their quote unquote flocking style. So next time you're out and looking at the birds, see if you can take note of whether the birds flock, how many there are, and what kind of style that they have in flocking. Next, I believe Chris will be speaking about habitat and bird identification.
Great, thanks, Isam. So what I wanted to talk a little bit about is the relationship between where you are and what you are seeing. Because oftentimes birds are going to be very, very specific in terms of the type of habitat that they inhabit. There are certainly some birds that, especially a lot of birds that we may see around here, that we might think of as kind of generalists that we will see in a variety of different types of habitats. Think of robins or cardinals or, you know, some of these crows. You know, we can go to all parts of DC, different habitats, and we're likely to see those birds there. But other birds, and I would say probably most birds, are going to be much, much more specific in terms of where they are. And there are some very important reasons why that is. Namely, what is it that these birds eat? Where do they prefer to shelter? And what type of nesting environment do they require? These types of things, food, shelter, and nesting sites, vary tremendously from different types of habitats. And this can also vary based on time of year as well. And so, you know, we talked a little bit about this last week, but just to kind of reiterate, we have a variety of different types of habitat. Again, not only just across the United States or around the world, but even in Washington, D.C., like wetlands, riparian woods, deciduous forests, grasslands, and again, just pure urban residential type of habitats. And just to kind of give a couple of examples here, take something like food. You know, you have some birds that are primarily seed eaters. And so they obviously need to be in a habitat where those seeds are abundant, where they're reliably found, and where hopefully the bird doesn't need to do a whole lot of work to find them. You have other birds, you know, he showed a couple slides ago, you know, ospreys. Ospreys are fish eaters. So they're going to be found in proximity to rivers and lakes where they can get their fish relatively easily. You're not going to see an osprey in Rock Creek Park, unless it's maybe flying over to try to get to the Potomac. You know, his example just a slide ago of those northern shovelers, you have a variety of different types of ducks and waterfowl that rely on aquatic vegetation to eat. You're going to find them on rivers and lakes. And even a couple times it's been mentioned the difference between dabbling ducks and diving ducks. Diving ducks completely submerge themselves underwater, oftentimes going deeper into the water to get things like crustaceans or small fish. They're obviously going to be found in deeper water than something that is too shallow to provide that type of food source. So thinking about what is it that this bird eats is going to be really important when you try to identify based on where you are. And I'd also kind of make a connection here to what we've talked a little bit about in terms of bird anatomy. A really good way to kind of understand a bird and even help and identify it is just to look at its beak. The anatomy of a bird's beak is going to be very indicative of what it is that it eats. So we talked about, you know, those raptors earlier tonight with those big, strong, curved, sharp beaks. If you're an osprey, you need something like that in order to rip open and eat a fish. If you're, we see this nuthatch on the slide right here, you're not eating fish, you don't need a big, powerful beak like that. But what the nuthatch does is it hunts for food in the crevices of tree bark, which is oftentimes very narrow and scraggly, and it's got to have a bill that can get into those tight spaces. So thinking about the bird's anatomy, especially its bill and its diet, is going to be a nice connection that you can make as you're learning about these birds and helping to identify them. Shelter. Most of the time, birds are going to be very interested in not being seen, especially perhaps if they're nesting or it's in a time of the day where they're not necessarily out feeding. Maybe they're worried about predators. So the ability of a bird to find shelter and reliable shelter is going to be really important. And that can also help you figure out if you're in a habitat that you see certain types of features there, what are some of the birds that I might find here, or at least live here if they may not be easy to find if they're trying to be kind of conspicuous. So a really good example here, and this is a classic example of a couple of birds that are notoriously difficult to see, because of how they shelter. So if we were to go to a place like Kenilworth Aquatic Gardens, which is a wonderful wetland here in DC that has a lot of high kind of and dense reeds, birds like bitterns and rails are very, very rarely seen because they are so wonderful in camouflaging themselves in this type of shelter. These are birds that you kind of have to get really, really lucky to see. You may hear them, but because of how they shelter and where they shelter, identifying them by sight is going to be really a matter of luck rather than skill, I would argue. Or think about some of these sparrows that we've been looking at tonight. Very oftentimes tangled hedges and bushes. They tend to like to shelter in those places because it's very, very difficult for predators to get at them. So thinking about shelter. And then finally, nesting. We're in the time of the year right now where many birds are mating and now trying to figure out how to find a nest site that is appropriate and that is also safe. And different types of birds nest differently. You have birds that nest in tree cavities. So think about these woodpeckers that we've been looking at tonight, or even wood ducks. We normally wouldn't think of ducks as nesting in trees, but wood ducks do. And so if you're in a habitat that has a lot of old dead trees with a lot of cavities, that might be a really attractive nesting spot for certain birds that rely on them. Or to get really, really specific, and this is a bird that is not found in DC, but I was doing some reading a couple weeks ago on Kirtland's warblers, which is a very, very rare species of warbler. They nest in a very, very, very specific way, namely in young jack pines on the lower branches of them. That's the only place that they nest. And so in particular, wooded areas in states like Michigan and Wisconsin, it's a very particular but very attractive and necessary nesting site for those birds. And if those aren't present, they're not going to nest there. So trying to get a sense of kind of where these birds are going to be feeding, sheltering, and nesting in particular habitats is something that will be a helpful tool to kind of learn as you go along and start trying to identify some of these birds. Okay, great. If we could go to the next slide, please. Beyond that, one of the things that I think you will also find as you gain more experience is that even within their habitat, many species tend to be seen in particular places. You know, most birds don't spend equal amounts of time in trees, on the ground, near water, in water. They are oftentimes also very, very particular about where they tend to hang out, we might say. And this is another thing that I think will become more intuitive to you as you are out in the field more. And in combination with the other things that we have talked about tonight in terms of identification, namely coloration, behavior, posture, we're going to talk about song in a few minutes. You're going to start to see how all these things work in combination with each other. And so one of the things I always ask myself when I'm out birding, and I especially if I may be kind of stumped by a bird that I'm observing, is I ask myself, should this bird be here? And oftentimes there's a very good reason why it either shouldn't be there or it should be there. And that's something that can really help you. And so kind of even the within the habitat, examples that you'll sometimes start to notice are, there's a particular species of bird that every time that I see it, it tends to be way high up in the treetops. Or I always see this bird on the ground. Or maybe it tends to only be found in really deep or dense shrubbery. Or maybe it's every time I see this bird, it's in flight. I would argue, and I think more experienced birders would say, that's not accidental that you're making that observation, because that tends to be the case for a lot of birds that are out there. And so if we could go to the next slide, I'll just give you a couple of examples that I've observed over the years. And starting on the top left here, we've got an indigo bunting. This is one of these kind of spring migrants that have shown up in DC over the last couple of weeks. Will be here throughout the summer. Very striking and very easily identifiable in terms of its color. There are only a couple, really solidly blue birds that you might find around here. Maybe a blue grosbeak being the other. It's got a very identifiable song. But what I always find about these buntings is that they always tend to be seen in the same place, which is very much high at the top of trees. I've never seen an indigo bunting on the ground. Usually when I hear that song, and usually with its song as loud and as distinctive as it is, it tends to be heard before it's seen. I immediately start looking at the top of treetops, and inevitably that's where I'm going to see it. Conversely, below it, we've got the eastern towhee, which is very much a ground-dwelling bird. These are birds that tend to find their food on the ground. They tend to kick up the leaf litter to search for their food, so oftentimes heard as well. You can kind of hear them rustling around a lot. And inevitably, when I hear them, I start looking down. And they are certainly in trees. I've seen them singing in trees, but more often than not, looking down is the best place to start if you think you've got a towhee in your midst. Chimney swifts on the top right. Chimney swifts are almost always seen in flight. They spend the vast majority of their life in the air. They feed in the air. Their anatomy, to go back to what we said earlier, is almost built against them being anywhere but in the air. It's really only when they roost and build their nests that they are not in flight. And this is a wonderful bird to see in cities. They are constantly in flight. You'll see them flying around, especially at dusk. And they are just very clearly a airborne bird that I can't imagine seeing a chimney swift anywhere else but in flight. And then finally, below the chimney swift, we've got the belted kingfisher. And here's a good example of where you will see it connected to what it eats. Kingfishers, as their name implies, they feed on fish. They tend to fly over rivers and small lakes, diving for their fish, and also a bird with a very distinctive kind of rattling call that you will learn very quickly. And oftentimes when I'm looking for a kingfisher after hearing it, where I will look is usually on kind of extended branches that kind of branch out over the water, where a kingfisher will be perched looking for fish, which it will then go out and dive after. Not going to be seen on the ground, not going to be seen in dense trees. They tend to like to be out exposed in the open near the water where they're going to be hunting. So this is something that I would argue kind of the more birding you do and the more you see some of these species repeatedly, you're going to notice this pattern that I tend to always see it in the same way in its habitat. So that can just be kind of another tool that you can use to help in your identification. Is just simply, should it be where I am, and especially even where I am in a more particular place. Okay, if we could go to the next slide. Okay, so now we're going to talk about vocalizations, and I'm going to turn things over to John.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, so bird vocalizations, I think we can all agree, is a topic that we would prefer to cover whilst we're all outside in the field and have a chance to actually listen to some examples as we discuss. But I figured it would be still helpful to include some information in slides on some basics and principles, and hopefully give everyone some ideas and some helpful insights. So when you go out, as you do over the next few weeks, at a socially and acceptable distance, of course, you can keep them in mind and hopefully improve your identification of bird vocalizations. So, I think we're very lucky as birders that, in addition to some of the interesting characteristics that we've already covered in this presentation, there's another dimension and a really great dimension to birding, which is the sounds that they make. you know, I love listening to bird calls. I find it cathartic and really interesting and really fun to try and parse out different noises that I'm hearing. It can be quite challenging and daunting to, you know, I think to sort of start if you don't have a lot of experience. But there are some helpful things to keep in mind and some really great resources out there that you can use to help you get better. So some basics about bird songs or vocalizations. Generally, birds make two different types of vocalizations, and I am generalizing here. And I should preface that, you know, some groups of birds vocalize much more than others, and some groups of birds have more diverse sets of vocalizations than others. But you know, for songbirds, for example, often you will hear them vocalize with a song. So if you think of, if you know what a robin sounds like, oftentimes you'll hear them calling, you know, for example, in the evening, or sorry, wrong term. You'll hear them singing often in the evening, and many other songbirds do the same. The purpose of songs are often to defend territories, let other birds know where they are in space, and that they have established a territory or an area that they are sort of claiming as their own. But then, of course, also mate finding is a really important function of vocalizations, and especially the songs that birds make. You know, oftentimes a male will set up a territory and then sing a lot during a certain time of year to try and attract a mate in. So very, very important function there. And then the other category we would call calls, which are more generalized communication that birds use. I think it's fair to say that bird calls often serve a more diverse group of functions than bird songs do. You'll hear chips and various other noises. You know, cardinals comes to mind as a species of bird that chips a lot and makes a lot of other noises beyond just its typical song. You'll hear call noises between young and adults. Alerts are a big group that fall within the call category. Going back to robins, they have a very distinct alarm alert call that they make. I think they always sound very panicky to me. And then in flocks also, or in groups of birds, you'll hear a lot of call type vocalizations just between the various birds in a given group. And of course, from an identification perspective, learning to identify birds by sound is a really, really important and helpful tool. As Chris alluded to, oftentimes you will hear a bird before you see one, and you know, being able to arrive at a habitat or you know, understanding where a bird might be in a tree, helpful to think about. And then as you start to hear the vocalizations, you know, you can hone in and say, okay, you know, I can clearly hear a distinct species of bird in this tree, and maybe a different species lower in some shrub over there. And you know, if you're able to identify that species, then that's great, and you can know what you're looking for as you bring your binoculars up to have a look. And then, of course, you know, it's also a really enriching and rewarding thing to be able to identify birds by vocalization in the context, especially of understanding their behavior, and being able to see birds vocalize with each other and use their calls is really special. Next slide, please. So just to build on that a little bit, within those kind of categories of, within the categories of bird song, you can further divide or classify into a few different terms. And these are terms that you will often see used in reference materials like field guides or your bird apps. They make use of a certain set of terms to help describe you know, the sounds that you hear from birds. So it's good to kind of have a sense for what each of these mean. So I'll just start at the top. I mean, trills, the example given here is a chipping sparrow. So it's usually sort of a short staccato, chip, 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 kind of repetitive noise. There are quite a lot of species that make similar trill or chipping calls, and one of the more challenging things is parsing out species that make those calls from each other, especially if they're in overlapping habitat. Whistling sounds, the American robin is a great example, kind of self-explanatory, I think, but obviously more of a longer kind of note, and often more variability in the song as it moves through. Another important group are birds that make buzzy noises. So like the blue-winged warbler kind of goes bzz, bzz. It's very buzzy, very distinct. And again, I think buzzy is a great word to describe it. And then flute-like can be a bit similar to whistling birds in a way, like robins and wood thrushes, for example. They're both species of thrush, but the wood thrush has a much more fluty, sort of nasal call, a bit more delicate. And so, thinking of a kind of a flute is a good way to conceptualize that sound. And then there's also a lot of birds that make very harsh, loud calls, like blue jays, kind of jarring, very high volume, not particularly acoustically, aesthetically pleasing, if you will, necessarily, but, very, very distinct and often more easy to identify. Next slide, please. So where to start? If you're relatively new to trying to learn, learning bird calls or bird songs, it certainly can seem daunting. I mean, if you go out on a busy morning when there's a lot of activity and you have, birds all around you singing at the same time, it seems like a very thankless task to try and start parsing out individual species or even multiple individuals of the same species that may be calling. But with some help from resources and practice and really focusing in on your ear, it's really quite achievable. I would say that as a baseline, the best place to start is starting with the more common birds that you're going to experience, whether it be in your backyard or where, your local birding patch. Being able to, identify those more common birds. Oftentimes those birds also have fairly distinct calls, which is good, is really helpful, because then you can kind of rule them out. If you're listening to a bird that you don't know, at least you can start from a place of knowing what it isn't. And so that's a really good strategy. So some examples here: robins, cardinals, Carolina wrens, ovenbird if you're in a sort of deciduous or forested habitat. These are birds that are fairly common, that you'll often experience birding in and around the DC area, and birds with fairly distinct calls that are fairly different from each other. And so, my advice would certainly be to start with those and get very solid and get confident identifying those, and it really will help you as you try and identify more challenging bird songs. When you are listening to birds and trying to sort of understand the nuances of their vocalizations and identify them to species, there are sort of multiple facets of their vocalizations to pay attention to. So an obvious one is the pattern of the call. I kind of touched on that a little bit with, for example, the trilling species like chip, 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 or, whereas, a robin may have a call that sort of moves around in sort of musical space a little bit more musical. Another important one is volume. I think people maybe don't pay enough attention to that, but different species of birds really do sing and call at different volumes. Again, going back to like the blue jay example, or cardinals, very loud generally, whereas warblers typically have more delicate songs. That's not always the case. Carolina wren, another species, really loud, really high volume. And then finally, the voice. And this is maybe a little bit more subtle depending on what group of species you're looking at, but birds do have voices, and different groups of birds can be distinguished from each other once you start to understand this sort of character of the noise that they're making. And I have a few acoustic examples to play, and I can highlight that a little bit more. It does take a lot of practice, and it does take a lot of patience, and it can be really frustrating. There are birds that make really, you know, individual species of birds. I'm thinking of goldfinches, for example, that just chatter and make a lot of noise, and a lot of times sound like various things at various times if you're not really honed in. And so, you know, it can be frustrating, but with practice and patience, it will pay off. And then I would add that there are really a lot of resources, really great resources for us to utilize, you know, to try and, as we learn bird songs. This list down here is certainly not exhaustive. But as an example, for example, the Larkwire app is a really great kind of helpful way. It kind of walks you through how to learn bird songs. I think there's kind of a quiz component to it, so a lot of people find that very helpful. Highly recommend downloading that, and a great way to sort of practice without having necessarily to actually go outside and listen to the birds, which, you know, at certain times is certainly very helpful. The Zeno Canto website is really interesting. It's a website where people around the world can actually upload their own recordings of bird species. So it's a really, really big and excellent repository of bird songs, and there's a lot of different examples of the same species, which can be very helpful as well, because, for example, many bird apps will only have 1 or 2 recordings of one species to listen to, but birds do have sort of dialects. You know, the same species of bird in one region does sound maybe slightly different than the same species in another region, so being able to have a more complete picture is very helpful. I would also just add that I imagine that some of you may already have, you know, an app on your phone, like a Peterson bird app or Sibley app, which are essentially app versions of the bird guides, you know, the book bird guides that we bring out into the field. Many of those also have pretty good recordings for all of the species. Some of them are a little bit limited in the actual, you know, they may only have a song for that species as opposed to a call. But nonetheless, when you're in the field and you hear a song and you can pull up that app and start playing through the different vocalizations, I find that very helpful. When you're in the field, being persistent, chasing down unfamiliar songs to get a look at the bird that's making it, you can't really replace that. That's extremely helpful. And then being able to actually see a bird, there's something about actually being able to see a bird singing, making its song, making its call, just really seems to help make it stick in your memory. So, you know, I really recommend spending the time in the field and spending time with those birds, watching them sing, really getting familiar with them. And, you know, at the end of the day, I still think that's going to be the best way to help learn. Next slide, please. So these are just some examples of species that are kind of helpful to discuss based on the information I've already covered. The top left here, for example, you have two species of chickadee. Carolina chickadee is a species that we hear more often in DC and has a very similar call to the more common northerly occurring chickadee. Very, very similar, but also different enough where if you play both of those songs together, you should be able to hear a difference there. Same is true for this is a good example. So on the right, we have a scarlet tanager and a robin. But these birds are quite different from each other. They're not closely related, but often their songs are confused with each other. This is a great example of voice, though. The scarlet tanager has a kind of a more throaty, it kind of sounds like a robin with a sore throat, a bit more of a I don't know how to describe it, harsher perhaps voice, and also of course sings from a very different habitat than robins, often at the top of trees, as a reference to thinking about habitat as you identify birds. But I recommend you know, playing, you know, using these examples and playing, you know, songs from these species back to back just to compare, and you can really hear the differences in voice and call pattern. The bottom left, we have a blue-headed vireo and a red-eyed vireo, two very closely related species of bird. Somewhat similar call patterns, but again, quite a different voice. And, you know, again, just really helpful to listen to, birds that are closely related to each other, or birds that have songs or vocalizations that are quite similar, to help you start listening to the differences between them. Next slide, please. Another really helpful tool that a lot of people find helpful is using mnemonics. So for birds that have fairly distinct song patterns or voices, it can be helpful to use these sort of mnemonic sayings and have them in your head as you try and pick out what species is which. Some of them I find less helpful than others, to be honest, but a great example in the bottom left is the Eastern Towhee, which the mnemonic for is drink your tea. And it really does often match that mnemonic very closely when you hear it in the field. I'm not going to go through all of these. Another favorite of mine is the white-throated sparrow, kind of in the center left there. Oh, sweet Canada, Canada, Canada. Obviously, the pitch is much higher when you hear it in the field, but again, that call pattern is pretty distinct, and the mnemonic is helpful for it. So there are more, but like I said, I'm not going to go through all of these. There's a good reference here, a reference link down in the bottom left, and hopefully you can go back and check this out on your own time. But again, a very helpful tool for a lot of folks. Next slide, please. Okay, so one of my favorite ways of digitally observing birds and listening to their songs is via YouTube. There's a few folks out there that have done a really fantastic job, spent a lot of time in the field with a lot of great gear, recording bird songs and giving you a very intimate look at them. And I thought I would just play like a minute of each one of these just to kind of give you an example of what I'm talking about. I'm gonna just go ahead and request control here. I figured that would be the easiest way. Okay, so opening up some YouTube. So hopefully you guys can hear and see that well. This is an Eastern Towhee, which has that drink your tea mnemonic, which hopefully you could hear there. But again, I would just say that these types of videos I find really helpful. You get a really close look at the bird making the vocalization. This particular guy, Lang Elliott, is a bit of a wizard with field recordings and video recordings of birds in the field. So I recommend checking out his channel. Let's see what else we have in here. So that's a scarlet tanager, another one that I mentioned before. Kind of sounds like a robin with a sore throat. Hopefully you could hear that kind of character to its voice there. Let's see what else. So that is an ovenbird. It's a warbler of the forest floor, another bird that we've touched on once or twice in this presentation. You will hear that call a lot if you're hiking in forest this time of year, and it's a great call to know. It's a bird that often, when I'm hiking with friends, people will hear it and say, "What is that?" It's a pretty loud call for a warbler. It has that sort of consistent, repetitive character to it. The mnemonic that's often used, and I think that's on the previous slide, is teacher, 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 teacher. So anyway, a great example of an ovenbird, and then one more. Okay, well, the video kind of paused there, but that was a great example of a white-throated sparrow call. Again, the kind of, oh, Canada, Canada, Canada. Hopefully you heard that pattern. That's another species that migrates through. I think they're probably passed mostly through DC at this point. But we have them in the early spring, really distinct, high-pitched call, a great one to practice and identify, and really fun to go and hear out in the field. So there's a lot of these types of videos. Definitely recommend checking out some of these channels if you want to do some birding from home. You find yourself with some free time. It's definitely a great way to pass it, and a really great way to learn birdsong. So highly recommend that as an approach as well. Next, oh, I'm controlling. Okay. So that's kind of the end of the birdsong section. I will pass off control to whoever's next to finish out. So thanks very much.
I think a lot of this is for when we do the course in person, because we have a field trip.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
I don't know if we can really do any of this now. I think that we should probably open it up to any final questions. We encourage you to look at our website. I'd say starting with these two lists, the City Slickers and Familiar 15, is a really great way to get started. If you start with the birds that are the most likely to encounter in DC, you can build out from there and learn behavior, habitat, song, calls, different vocalizations. Does anyone have any questions here? Are there any other final thoughts, notes? I had someone ask about the first webinar recording, which we put on our website, and it looks like you need to have a password, and only potentially the people that registered for that first webinar will get that. So we're going to look into putting that password on the website so other people can access it. Some final notes. I just wanted to say, following up on all these different topics, I rarely identify birds by sight. I usually look at how they're moving, what their behavior is, where they are. And now that I know almost all the bird songs, but not all of them, I use my ears. And so it's really a gradual process. And so sometimes the behavior and the habitat is really the best way to start. And if there are songs that you're hearing a lot, starting to pick those up, it will open up a whole new world of experience when you're being out in the field birding.
Just a quick reminder to everyone to fill out our speed peck survey. It's pretty short, won't take too long, and it would help us improve this course for the future.
All right, it doesn't look like we're getting very many more questions. There's a couple of people that are commenting. Thanks everyone for joining. I'm going to end the webinar now. We look forward to seeing you in the field and keep in touch. We have more programming besides tomorrow's bird-friendly wildlife gardening webinar. So just if you haven't signed up already for a newsletter, there's more information on the website. Thanks everyone. Good night.